Well, thank you so much for that welcome. And I wanted to thank Earthwatch for inviting me today and for hosting this incredible summit. It's been really amazing to be able to connect with other researchers, people at Earthwatch, and also some of my previous volunteers, which are here in the audience, in fact. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a project that we've been doing looking at human impacts on marine mammals. And in Southern California, we're very fortunate. We have a great diversity of animals, including the magnificent blue whale, which is still the largest animal to have ever lived. And when you see an animal like this in person, it's quite awe-inspiring. But unfortunately, many of the animals we see show evidence of human impacts. This particular animal has a propeller wound on its back. Fortunately, that was a relatively minor injury, and the animal appears to be doing just fine. But many times they don't get away as easily. We also have the California sea lion, which is sort of iconic in our waters. But much too frequently, we observe injuries like this animal that still has a fishing line wrapped around its neck. And clearly, that type of injury will be fatal if this animal is not rescued. We see the humpback whales, which of course are well known for their amazing breaches. And much of the interactions we see are not quite as dangerous as a fishing line or boat strike, but are more of a disturbance. But it can be problematic because over time, having so many people surrounding an animal can really disturb their natural behaviors, prevent them from feeding, and cause them to move offshore. So why do we see so many conflicts? Really, it comes down to the fact that we live in this beautiful area. The coast attracts many visitors, and so it tends to look a little bit more like this during the summertime, and all of those people, of course, also provide a lot of pollution and a lot of other impacts. LA is also home to one of the largest ports in the world, which looks very pretty from this view, but really has a huge amount of boat traffic, very large vessels, and many issues that come with having this amount of boat traffic in an area with so much marine life. So why do we care about these animals? Well, besides the obvious appeal, many of the species we are studying are endangered or threatened, and many of the others we just don't even know enough to be able to assess the population status. So we're really lacking baseline data on most of these animals. I was at a conference recently where somebody pointed out that monitoring is not sexy science. And it's very hard to get people to commit to putting in the time that you need to get that baseline data. So the way we are investigating this is working with Earthwatch. And it's been a really invaluable relationship. So the participants who come along and help us collect data on animals such as this blue whale are really essential to giving us the hands-on assistance that we need in collecting the data, analyzing it, and helping to spread the information also. So where do we do this work? Well, if you go across the country from here, and just south of LA is an area called Dana Point. And we work primarily out of Dana Point. We do transects, where we charter a boat, and we follow a set path going north one day a week, south the other day. We also go off to Catalina Island and do transects in a smaller boat along the front of the island, because there's different species in these two different areas. In addition, we do some of our work from shore, where we use a theodolite to track animals where we are not imposing any disturbance ourselves. And in all of these platforms, we collect data on every marine mammal species we see. So we record their location, what they're doing. We use photographs to identify individuals. And we also record the boat traffic, because we're really interested in those human impacts. Once we get that data, we map it. So we plot all of the sightings. This particular image is showing the sightings of blue whales from one summer. And what you might notice is that the lines show our tracks of where we went. And you can see a lot of areas where we didn't see any blue whales. But all of the whales show up right along the continental shelf edge, which is exactly what we had predicted, since that's an area of upwelling, which brings lots of nutrients and food for the foraging blue whales. As I mentioned, we see a variety, and we do this work year-round, but in the summer, one of our main sightings are blue whales. We also see a lot of dolphins, common dolphins, blue whales, and we have slightly different sightings in the two areas, more dolphins off of Catalina and more of the larger whales off of Dana Point. So those anthropogenic impacts, there are lots of things we could be investigating, but to hone in on one specific thing, we're trying to focus on vessel traffic, and that can take the shape of a very large freighter. This image shows an animal that was barely missed getting struck, and of course, being hit by a boat of that size is generally fatal. But it can be something that seems as mild as a stand-up paddleboarder next to an animal. But you can see this person is only about 10 or 15 feet away from this blue whale. And so we record all of those boats that we see in relationship to the animals. And this is just one map showing data from a single day. And the pink symbols are showing the boats. And of course, there's lots of boats around the harbor entrance. But what you may also note, I don't know how well you can see it, but there were bottlenose dolphins and blue whales right in that spot, and lots of boats all around the animal. And pretty much every time we see a large whale, there are multiple boats following the animals. So to give you an example of what this can look like, I wanted to show you some video. This particular image, if you can see, there's a blue whale here, this guy on a stand-up paddleboard, a kayaker, and a speedboat. This photograph is taken from a whale watch boat, which you'll see in this next video. So this stand-up paddleboarder proudly shared this video that he obtained while following this blue whale. Now you can see how incredibly close he is. He's chasing after the whale, and people were yelling at him from the whale watch boat, saying, "You're much too close to this animal." And his response on his post was that he was quiet. He's a stand-up paddleboarder. He wasn't that big, loud whale watch boat that you can see in the distance here, staying a safe distance away. And he honestly believes that he's having a spiritual connection with the whale and that he's not causing any problem. But as you can see, he's clearly chasing the animal, getting much closer than the guidelines, which limit approaches to 100 meters. And he's literally getting on top of the whale to get this imagery. And this, surprisingly, is not the only video like this, and we see this relatively frequently when we're out in the water. So I think many people would love to have that kind of encounter with a blue whale, but they also have to recognize the disturbance that they are imposing by getting on an animal like that and really changing the reaction of the animal and what it's doing, since it's there in the area to feed. So what I would like to do is give some examples of the research that we are doing. And starting with the blue whale, we are using photographs to identify individuals. So here's a particular animal, skunk, named because of the clear white mark on the dorsal fin. And we've seen it in both 2013 and 14. And in 3 years, we've identified 62 individual animals. We usually have about 20 to 30 each summer. Relatively low resightings, which isn't necessarily meaning that they're not coming back to the area, but they have a pretty large home range. And so they could easily be in just another part of Southern California, and we might not see them. And so we are developing more collaborations and working with colleagues who are studying in other areas to share our photographs. One way we look at disturbance is by studying the diving and breathing patterns of the animals. So blue whales will come up, they'll take a breath, they'll go under just shallow and take another breath, and do that for a number of times before they take a deeper, longer dive. And for blues, dives can be anywhere as short as 5 minutes up to 15 or 20 minutes, and they might breathe 5 to 15 times at the surface. One of the things I like about this image is you can see how close to shore these animals are, and that this is very much an urban environment where these animals are found. So when we look at these respiration patterns, we can see how they're affected by boat presence. The good news is that from our preliminary data, when we looked at all the different dive parameters, we don't see a difference whether there's a boat in the area or there's not. And so that's very encouraging. But some data is showing other influences. So for example, it looks like we have an increase in swim speed and more deviation or path changes when boats are in the area. Now, it's difficult to get this data because you have to have area times when there aren't boats and when there are. And so we're continuing to collect data on this and trying to really determine what the boat influence really is on these animals. The next one I want to talk about are gray whales. And there's two populations to this one species. The red shows the population that's known as the eastern northern Pacific, which is found along the western coast. It's considered recovered. It's been removed from the endangered species list, whereas the western population is critically endangered with only about 130 individual animals. The ones that we are studying are migrating along our coast. We see those in Southern California. We also study them in British Columbia when they're foraging and in Baja when they're breeding. One study that we did on these animals looked at injuries, and we examined over 1,600 individual animals from photographs taken for ID to determine what types of injuries they had. Most of the animals had scars, which fortunately tend to be relatively minor marks that probably happen naturally, as you can see in this scar here. Some of them have injuries to the tail or the fluke. Here you can see what was probably a bite taken out of the animal's tail. A number have rake marks, which is from orca attacks. This is very much an underestimate in terms of numbers because most of the marks would be on the flippers or the flukes, and we don't have as many images of that body part. And then we have things like major wounds. So this one is pretty shocking, but surprisingly, this animal has survived with that wound for many years. It's found in this particular animal, has been observed in many different areas over a number of years, and it continues to look like that. So even over time, it hasn't fully healed. Nobody knows really what caused that, but we think it was probably an exploding harpoon. There's also evidence of entanglement from fishing lines, as we can see in this animal. So the good news is only about 2% of the animals are showing signs of clear injury from humans. But clearly, these are all underestimates because these are the animals that survived. The third example I want to talk about are California sea lions. And this is a new study that we started this last year, looking at them from a jetty with a spotting scope and watching the sea lions that are hauled out on a buoy to see the effects of vessel traffic. We get a lot of different boats. The majority are speedboats. And this data comes from 172 interactions with boats compared to other ones where there were no boats in the area. Again, some good news. On average, we see no effect of the boats on their activity. They spend about the same amount of time being alert or active or inactive, whether there's boats or not. And there's also no influence on them jumping on or off the buoy, which is another variable we examined. But at the same time, we see extremes. So here we observed a male sea lion on a buoy, and we saw these jet skiers circling around the buoy multiple times trying to touch the animal. You can see in this particular image, the guy is reaching out to touch them, and the next picture, his frustration because he just barely missed. I think he should be relieved. Since that was a male, he probably would have lost an arm. And these kind of things we know are a disturbance. And so part of what we're trying to do now is pull out those extreme interactions from the average ones, which don't seem to be problematic. So people then say, well, if boats could be a problem, should we stop whale watching? And what I'm observing with our data is that the average interaction is not a problem. People following the guidelines does not seem to disturb the animals. And there are guidelines as far as how close you should get, how you should not cut in front of them, reduce speed in the area. The problem are those extremes that happen. Another important guideline is to let the animal approach you. So many people have probably been on a boat and had bow riding dolphins and wondered, is this a problem? And one thing I love about this view is you can see the dolphins coming to the boat. They are clearly seeking out that interaction. And so people can have this experience where they get that up-close personal interaction with a wild animal, but it's on the animal's own terms. I also see the whale watch organizations as a great opportunity for citizen science. So the data that we collect, we use a data sheet, a GPS, and it's relatively straightforward, but it does require training. Much of the information, though, comes down to 4 simple things. Who are we seeing? What are they doing? Where are they? And when are we observing them? And much of that can be automatically recorded using a mobile app. So we developed Whale Map to allow the public to contribute additional sightings. And what we do is it tracks where you're going, so it keeps track of your effort, which is very important for the science aspect. And you say people saw a gray whale, which this was observed off of Dana Point last year, and they can record that, and then they can also visualize what they're seeing. To record their sighting, they get a drop-down menu with a species list so that it makes it a little bit easier and very user-friendly. And then, in this case, they indicate that's a gray whale, how many, what kind of behavior, and even can add a photograph that gets connected to that sighting record. One key feature of this is that we've designed it to work globally. So depending on where you are, you get a different region-specific species list. And also important with that is that it works when disconnected, so that you don't have to have cell coverage, which is obviously limited when you're offshore. And then this data gets shared to a geodatabase, and this is the web interface so that anybody can go on and see the data that's been collected. And this is at whalemap.org. Here's the current map of the sightings. We've had over nearly 200 trips with over 1,500 sightings recorded just with beta testers. And if you click on a point, it gives you more detail. So this particular animal was a humpback whale that was observed. One of the key things that we wanted to build into this was that this data would be useful for researchers. And it's freely available to whomever wants to use it. So this could be a graduate student, it could be a manager working at NOAA, and they could query the data and download it into a shapefile, which they can use for further analyses. We also want this to be used as an educational tool. So we're developing curriculum that a teacher could take into her classroom and use to show students how you can take data and make hypotheses and actually test them with data that's available, and hopefully for some of these kids, they can even get out in the field and use the app to collect some of their own data. So to summarize, the good news is that our data is showing that with following the guidelines, staying the appropriate distance, that we can have these safe interactions with the animals that are not harmful. But there are those extremes, and those can be quite dangerous for the animals and for the people. So we're continuing with this project. We are expanding some of our analyses so that we can really identify what interactions are most problematic. We are also expanding the whale map and hoping to have a wide-scale release so that we can really generate a lot of important data. And we're also working with local boaters, both the commercial whale watch groups and the recreational boaters, to try and help them understand safe approaches and what's going to not be a disturbance to the animals. And of course, none of this work would be possible without the support of Earthwatch and our amazing volunteers. And so I really encourage many of you to think about participating if you haven't already. There's an incredible opportunity to really get hands-on experience and contribute to the research. And I'd like to acknowledge all of the many groups and individuals who have contributed to this project. And I appreciate your time. Time for questions?
So I know there's no bio break in our schedule. Just pretend you're on expedition, and if you have to go out there behind a tree, it's okay. Anyway, we do have time for a couple questions, so please raise your hand, and one of our technical people will come to you with a microphone. Everything you always wanted to know about a whale but was afraid to ask. Yes, right there. Okay.
Hi, I was on the Earthwatch in June. It's a great project. What, if anything, and I think we talked about this, are the police or the security people for those extreme folks, what are you doing, or what is the town or whatever doing to help get rid of those extreme folks?
Okay, that's a very good question. We get that a lot.
Maybe repeat the question.
So the question was basically about enforcement. What do we do about those really bad interactions? And it's difficult because I pointed out guidelines. One of the things I didn't make clear is that there aren't laws in most areas. They are guidelines. There is the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is a law that says you cannot disturb or harass a marine mammal. And it's very hard to demonstrate. So we do report those interactions, and we will take photographs of the boats and any call numbers we can, any identifying information, and we report it to NOAA, which is the enforcement agency. But I have spoken with people there who've said they have a hard time actually following through and making any convictions. There are other areas where there are volunteer boaters who come out and try to educate people, and we've had conversations about trying to develop something like that, a network of people who would help and at least spread the information. So that's something that we're working on.
Right in the back. Thank you.
What's your dialogue been with the shipping companies? Is there something they can do, like limit the routes they come into Long Beach?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't personally been involved with that as much, but there are some other people. And they have actually shifted the shipping lanes in Santa Barbara. So not the ones off of Long Beach, but further north, where they'd had a number of ship strikes killing blue whales. One season, they had 7 blue whales killed. And so they did move the shipping lanes based on some of the data. One of the difficulties is that the whales move. And one thing I'm hoping that the app will help with is giving more real-time data on where the animals are at any one time. And there's a big push to have dynamic shipping lanes so that there'd be multiple paths, and the boats would find out which one to take day by day, depending on where the animals are at that time.
Thank you.
Are the dolphins not in danger of proximity to the boats the way the whales are?
That's a good question. I've heard people say, oh, they never get hit, but we've actually seen some actually been hit occasionally. But they are much more mobile. And I think the bow wave pushes them away from the boat to a large degree. And so it's pretty rare that you'll have a collision between the boats and dolphins. So it's much less of a problem. And as you can see, you can't really avoid them because they come to the boats. Nobody knows for sure. To be honest, it looks like they are coming for fun. I mean, it's hard. That's a hard thing to say scientifically because how do we judge what's fun and what's play? But they'll come out of the way, they'll stop what they're doing, and they're not using it to get anywhere because they'll take a detour from their path. And they'll often do lots of leaps and things, and it really does look like it may be a play behavior for them.
Part of long human dolphin lore.
Right.
I have one question. Is it better or worse to put a tracking device on versus a human observation, and what's the cost benefit?
That's a good question. So there are a lot of people who are tagging the animals, and you can get some really excellent data with tags. I think it depends on what question you're trying to ask. So if you want to know about long-range movements, you really need to tag the animals because that gives you the details. But they do, especially the long-term tags, they are invasive. Mm-hmm. You know, you have to basically harpoon it into the animal. And blue whales are so large, it's probably not much of an issue. But some of the smaller animals, they have had some problems. There's shorter duration tags, which are great in that they're suction cups, but you have to get right on top of the animal pretty close to attach it. And so that implies a certain amount of stress. So I think for most of our questions, staying at a safe distance and having more of a passive interaction is more useful, but I think tagging does give us a lot of benefits too.
One more question.
What were the factors that led to the recovery of the coastal gray whales on our side of the ocean, and what are the factors that are preventing the recovery on the Russian side?
That's a good question, and we have some ideas, but of course nobody really knows. So obviously when they stopped whaling, that was very important. One of the reasons we think that the gray whales have recovered pretty well is that they're opportunistic. So they will feed on lots of different food items depending on what's available, and so they can respond to shifts and take advantage of new opportunities. In terms on the other side, they claim that there's no more hunting, although that is probably not the case. So that's part of what might be limiting them. There's also movement between the population, which was a relatively new discovery that came from a tagged animal, actually. And how that plays into it is still really under investigation.
So please join me in thanking Lei Lani. That was wonderful.
Thank you.